Beyond?
Ladies and gentlemen, gosh, hey, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. And on a fly-in day, it's indeterminate where members of Congress are, except for one thing. We have, because of the great work of the National Right to Work Committee, we have a record number of co-sponsors, 30, and it increases every time I ask. And so this is so impressive. I'm Joe Wilson, a member of Congress representing the 2nd District of South Carolina. And today I'm grateful to be joining with 30 other colleagues to introduce the National Right to Work Act for the 118th Congress. We're also pleased that the National Right to Work Committee, President Mark Mix, is here. His organization is crucial for the efforts that we have to get the legislation approved. And of course, Mark actually is a living legend, and he has been significant to provide really what was perceived to be the impossible, particularly for the young people here, the thought that there would be a majority of American states adopt a right to work law. That was never hypothesized, but the Right to Work Committee made that possible. Importantly, Senator Rand Paul is introducing the companion legislation in the U.S. Senate. Every American should have the power to decide whether or not to negotiate for themselves and their employer, and no American should be forced to pay union dues just to keep a job. However, when Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, it established the concept of, quote, monopoly bargaining, end of quote, which enlists workers who want nothing to do with the union into abiding union rules, being bound by union contracts, and most revealing, paying union dues. As early as 1947, Congress tacitly admitted that this violates the rights of workers. While making automatic enrollment the default, they allowed states to opt out if they passed a right to work law. 27 states, including my home state of South Carolina, have done so, and now we have the ability to mitigate the negative effects that have been previously created by the federal labor law that had on their citizens and economy. However, the fact remains that Congress created this problem by making automatic enrollment the default position for all states. Now it's the responsibility of Congress to correct it. The National Right to Work Act does just that by simply listening to a majority of American workers and erasing the automatic dues clauses in federal statute. It does so without adding a single letter to the federal law. The American people support the National Right to Work Act. Polls indicate that nationwide opposition to compulsory unionism and enrollment is around 80%. More importantly, Americans are voting with their feet and with their wallets, and right-to-work states have consistently gained in population, economic growth, and job creation. Right-to-work states like South Carolina have seen firsthand the job creation and robust economy that develops when we expand and protect freedom in all forms. It was crucial for South Carolina in the journey to become the leading manufacturer and exporter of tires, with Michelin of France, Bridgestone of Japan, Continental of Germany, and GT of Singapore, while also being America's largest exporter of cars with BMW and Volvo. This is common sense policy, supported by 8 out of 10 Americans, which protect American workers, American families, and create jobs. Just this past year, under the leadership of Governor Henry McMaster and Commerce Secretary Harry Lightsey, South Carolina, because of the right to work law, has attracted $10.2 billion worth of new investments. This follows the tradition of the late Governor Jim Edwards that recruited Michelin, the late Governor Carroll Campbell that recruited BMW, somebody many people have heard of, former Governor Ambassador Nikki Haley was successful with Boeing. And so we're so grateful, 10,000 jobs in Charleston. We want every country to have several 787s. I urge all my colleagues in the House of Representatives to support this vital piece of legislation that gives rights back to the American workers. Again, I want to thank my fellow members and the President of the National Right to Work Committee, Mark Mix, for their ongoing support of this important legislation, and I'm now happy to introduce President Mark Mix.
Congressman, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for attending today and talking about right to work. This is common sense legislation, and it's no surprise that Joe Wilson, who's served South Carolina, served a senator, served a congressman, served in the National Guard, in the National Guard Reserve, and serves now the people of his district as a member of Congress for a long time. And Congressman Joe Wilson stood up for freedom and liberty throughout his entire career. His 4 sons have dedicated their lives to serving this country in the military, and he's serving his constituents here in the United States Congress. And now he's serving United States workers by introducing a bill, as he said, doesn't add a single word to federal law. In a town where 2,000 or 4,000 page legislation is hard to figure out, hard to read, and certainly hard to vote for when you only have it 24 hours in advance, a one-page bill that doesn't do anything except remove the bias in federal law in favor of forced unionism. This law comes from the 1930s. As Congressman mentioned, the power of union officials expanded so dramatically from 1935, well, actually 1937 when the Supreme Court upheld the Wagner Act, to 1947 that Congress had to do something about it. And instead of repealing the entirety of this federal invasion of states' rights as it relates to labor policy, they decided just to amend it and give states the affirmative right to opt out of the forced unionism that is entrenched in federal law. You know, if you go to the 23 states that don't have right to work laws, it's not state statutes that basically compel workers to pay dues or fees in order to work. It's federal law that was created right here in Washington, D.C., and that's why we have to come back here to get rid of that bias in favor of compulsory unionism in the National Labor Relations Act. We'd also like to add protections for railway employees that have been covered by forced fees since 1951. Unions had to wait a couple of years before they could get the power to organize the workers in 1926 until they had consolidated their power enough to come back to Congress and say, we ought to force all these railway employees to pay union dues in order to work. So the bill fixes the National Labor Relations Act in favor of voluntary unionism, and it repeals the provision in the Railway Labor Act that forces railway employees to pay dues or fees in order to keep their jobs. Good, solid legislation, large majorities of support, and we're honored to have Congressman Wilson as our sponsor of this bill this year.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd be happy for either of us to answer questions. And the President is too humble, and that is the right to work also is available to provide legal services to assist workers as they try to have their freedoms. And so in every way, the Right to Work Committee makes a difference on behalf of the American worker and people.
Thank you.
And Mr. Gizzi, you're here.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you.
Always management has run into trouble when Democrats are in power and have appointments to the National Labor Relations Board and the far less known, but possibly more powerful National Mediation Board, which oversees, I think, railway, airplane, and other transportation workers. Does your legislation affect them in any way and limit or even neuter their efforts to encourage union dues and union membership?
Yeah, John. Congressman Wilson's bill does address the Railway Labor Act and addresses the forced unionism provisions that were added in 1951. The Railway Labor Act has been amended twice after its passage in 1926, and the Second Amendment in 1951 was to force workers in the railway and airline industry to pay union dues in order to keep their jobs. Unfortunately, if you're living in the state of South Carolina and you work for an airline, you can still be forced to pay dues or fees in order to keep your jobs because the Railway Labor Act doesn't allow for enforcement of a state right to work law. So that's why we are going into the Railway Labor Act to get that part of it. So yeah, the bill will amend the Railway Labor Act to free those workers from being forced to pay dues or fees as a condition of getting or keeping a job.
And indeed, John, we've seen the abuse of the NLRB, the General Counsel. And in South Carolina, we have the classic case with the help of the Right to Work Committee to fight back. The General Counsel came in and announced as Boeing was placing its manufacturing facilities in Charleston, and there was 1,000 people working at the facility. It was a 100,000 square foot building, and the NLRB came in and said, you can't build planes here. You'll be happy to know that that was highly offensive to Governor Nikki Haley. And joining in with Senator Tim Scott, Senator Lindsey Graham, with Congressman Trey Gowdy, myself, and we have a very positive and proactive Attorney General, Alan Wilson, my number one son. And so, hey, we as a group sued them. And so, ultimately, it was successful. That's why there are nearly 10,000 people working at the facility in Charleston, building 787 jetliners. I urge you all to visit the holy city of Charleston, because when you do, you'll see the manufacturing facility right at the airport. And each of the tail fins is a work of art. They're not just planes. And so, Boeing is successful because we fought back. But the NLRB and the abuses that can occur. But I know that Right to Work was so helpful to the legal proceedings that were ultimately successful.
Yeah. How confident are you that this is actually going to get past the finish line, and what pushback do you foresee?
Well, I'll be working with our leadership, and indeed, I'm just so grateful for the leadership of Speaker Kevin McCarthy. I was with him a few minutes ago. What a breath of fresh air. And so we will be working with the various committees that have jurisdiction. I look forward to working with, hey, we can't do any better than Chairwoman Virginia Fox. And so we've got good people who will be doing all that we can to get it through this year. And then you never give up. I mean, who would ever imagine that the Right to Work Committee would be successful having a majority of the states, 27. And so it's an issue that's right, and so we'll keep fighting.
Exactly. That's a great answer. We're going to continue to push for it. Just like many projects and programs in Washington, D.C., every journey begins with a step. And the journey to provide freedom to America's workers start with the introduction of this bill, and we'll move forward from here. We may be seeing you again 2 years from now in the 119th Congress, but we'll see you just the same.
Well, and we need to make sure John Gizzi's here. I think you had a second question. Did any other questions?
No. One thing is that what is the history of this? Are you the first member of Congress to introduce legislation like this, or has it been attempted?
Well, we actually have a historian here by the name of President Mark Mix.
John, we've introduced the bill several times. We've had other co-sponsors. Congressman Wilson's been with us, I think, 5 Congresses now as the primary. Senator Rand Paul has been the sponsor in the Senate since he was elected. We've had other members of Congress that have sponsored. Steve King was a sponsor of the bill. I'm not sure if Dick Armey ended up sponsoring this bill. He helped us with some other stuff that we were doing, and others have done that. But, you know, this bill, literally one-page bill, doesn't add a single word to federal law, is the type of legislation that Congressman Wilson gets behind all the time.
Here.
Yeah. Mark Tapscott? Yeah.
And you mentioned Senator Paul's introducing the Senate. With Senator Sinema going into it and Senator Manchin, I'm not sure. Do you think there is a prospect of some Democrats coming to this?
I would hope so, but I know how tough their situation is. The unions have quote invested, and it's legitimate, and so I would, but again, you just never give up. Okay, I'm actually celebrating this month. I introduced legislation called the Elimination of the Widow's Tax, which was a DoD VA offset to widows, and I was told from the day I was elected 21 years ago that it could never pass. Well, actually, President Trump signed it into law a year and a half ago. This month, the widows got their first check. But if I had a nickel for every time people told me that you're wasting time, I would be a wealthy guy.
Mark, as far as Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, those are interesting case studies. They both come from right-to-work states. Senator Manchin is a new addition to the right-to-work roster. Interestingly enough, neither of those two co-sponsored the PRO Act, which was co-sponsored by 47 other Democrats. And so the first thing that the PRO Act is going to do is repeal the 27 state right-to-work laws that exist today. They did not co-sponsor the bill. Neither did Mark Warner from Virginia. So those 3 Democrats stayed out of the fight, if you will. And we understand that Senator Bobby Scott from Virginia, a right-to-work state, is going to be introducing the PRO Act again tomorrow in the House. But I suspect they'll have a little different outcome than they had in March of 2021 when the bill passed with 225 votes to 209. So I think the House has changed a little bit in that regard.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, as far as I can remember, right to work has had big majority support in the public for decades. Most of the open seats that are going to be defended in 24 are Democrats.
That's right. And so real opportunity for the incumbent Democrats as they're looking ahead for the election next cycle next year. We're into it, and indeed, with the success of the Right to Work Committee getting the information out, it makes a real difference. And so there's a distinct chance.
And you're absolutely right about that, Congressman. I mean, this is an issue where the American people ought to know where their elected officials stand on compulsion versus freedom when it comes to the American workplace. And so a roll call vote on the National Right to Work Act would be a victory in both chambers or either chamber. We did get the vote last time in the House. There was every House member went on record with the PRO Act that would repeal the 27 right to work laws, and the majority changed in 2022. So,
Here.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you all for coming. And again, it's an honor for me to be with a living legend, and except that there are two living legends in this room with John Gizzi, so this is good. And just an honor to be here. And again, we never give up. And so I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to work with the committee, and it's going to be positive. Thank you very much.